I want you to imagine waking up one morning to a knock at your door, and when you open it, there are two men in black suits standing on your doorstep. Not police officers, not delivery drivers, but private security for one of the wealthiest men in the country. And one of them looks at you, stone-faced, and says, "Mr. Calloway, Mr. Hargrove would like to see you, today. His helicopter is waiting." And I want you to think about what you would do in that moment. Because I'll be honest with you, my first instinct was to slam the door in their faces and pretend I wasn't home. But I couldn't do that, because standing right behind me, tugging on the back of my shirt with her tiny little fingers, was my 5-year-old daughter, Emma, asking me who those men were. And I had to make a decision right then and there that I knew was going to change our lives forever, one way or another. So before I tell you everything that happened, every twist, every confrontation, every moment that made me feel like the ground was disappearing beneath my feet, I need to ask you one thing. If you had been in my position, if you had built a quiet, humble, beautiful little life for yourself and your child, and then one single night threatened to unravel all of it, what would you have done? Would you have gotten on that helicopter? I need you to think about that, because every choice I made from that morning on is something I am still sitting with today. And I'll let you decide for yourself whether I made the right ones. My name is Daniel Calloway. I'm 34 years old. I live in a 2-bedroom rental house on the edge of a mid-sized town in Oregon, and for the last 5 years, since my daughter Emma came into this world, I have been doing this parenting thing completely on my own. Emma's mother, Priya, and I weren't together when Emma was born. We had dated for about 8 months back when I was 28, and it was one of those relationships that felt magical right up until the moment it stopped feeling that way. We were good together in the beginning. She was warm, funny, absolutely brilliant, worked as a graphic designer for a small agency downtown. I was a sous chef at a restaurant that had just started getting some buzz in the local food scene. We used to cook together on her nights off and pretend we were hosting a dinner party for celebrities who weren't there. It sounds ridiculous now, but it was genuinely some of the happiest time of my life. But we wanted different things. She wanted to travel, to be free, to take her career somewhere bigger. I was rooted. I wanted a home base, a community, a life that felt stable and consistent. So when things ended, it was mostly mutual and mostly quiet. We parted with kindness, or at least with the intention of kindness. And then 4 months after we broke up, Priya called me and told me she was pregnant. I will never forget that phone call for as long as I live. I was standing in the walk-in cooler at the restaurant, because I ducked in there to take a personal call away from the noise of the kitchen, and when she told me, everything in that cold room went completely, absolutely still. I asked her what she wanted to do. She said she didn't know yet. We talked for almost 2 hours that evening, sitting in my car in a parking lot, and by the end of it we had agreed on a plan. She would carry the baby, she wanted to do that, but she was not ready to be a mother in the full-time sense. She was moving to New York in 2 months for a major career opportunity, and she didn't want to give that up. She was honest about it in a way that I actually respected, even though it was hard to hear. She said, "Daniel, I know this is a lot to put on you, but I think you'd be an incredible father, and I think this baby deserves someone who is completely ready to show up for them. I don't think I'm that person right now. Are you?" And I said yes, without hesitation. I said yes, because I meant it with every single part of me. We drew up a legal agreement. She would be on the birth certificate. She would retain parental rights, but I would have full physical custody. She would contribute to Emma's care financially when she could, and she would not disappear from Emma's life entirely. She would be Priya, someone Emma knew, who sent cards and video called on birthdays, who was always going to be honest about who she was to Emma when Emma was old enough to understand. And for 5 years, that arrangement worked. Was it perfect? Absolutely not. Was it lonely sometimes? More than I can describe. But Emma was the most extraordinary human being I had ever encountered, and she made everything. The exhaustion, the financial stress, the missing out on things my single friends were doing, all of it. She made it all not just bearable but genuinely worthwhile. Every single day. I had left the restaurant world about 2 years after Emma was born, because the hours were incompatible with being a solo parent. I transitioned into catering and private event cooking, which gave me more control over my schedule. I built up a small but steady client base, doing dinner parties and corporate luncheons and the occasional wedding. It wasn't glamorous and it wasn't making me rich, but it paid the rent and put food on our table and let me be home in time to read Emma her bedtime story, which I considered a non-negotiable priority. We had a good life, a real textured, beautiful small life, Emma had started kindergarten at the local public school and had already made two best friends, a girl named Claudia and a boy named Marcus. And she used to describe everything they did together with a level of dramatic detail that genuinely reminded me of myself. She was curious and gentle and had this way of tilting her head when she was thinking hard about something that made me feel like my entire chest was made of glass. Now I need to tell you about the event that started everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. About 8 months before those men in suits showed up at my door, I took a job catering a private dinner party at a rented estate about 40 minutes outside of town. The client had hired me through a referral from one of my regular corporate clients. And the brief was elegant but modest: 12 guests, 5 courses, contemporary American cuisine with a nod toward Pacific Northwest ingredients. The pay was excellent, more than I typically made for a single event, and the venue was stunning. A glass and timber property nestled in the hills with views that made you feel like you were sitting inside a painting. I arrived early in the afternoon with my assistant, a 22-year-old culinary school graduate named Brett, who helped me on larger jobs, and we set up the kitchen and the service area and began prep. The guests started arriving around 7 in the evening. I was mostly in the kitchen, as I always am at these events, but I did circulate briefly during the cocktail hour to check in with the host, a man named Gerald, who was the one who had hired me, and to get a sense of the mood and pace of the evening. And that is when I first saw her. She was standing near the large windows that overlooked the valley below, holding a glass of white wine, wearing a deep blue dress, and she was laughing at something someone had just said. Not a polite laugh. A real one. The kind that takes over your whole face and makes you look completely unguarded. Her name, I would learn later that evening, was Sophia Hargrove. She was 31 years old, and she was without question the most captivating person I had been in a room with in years. I want to be careful here about how I tell this part, because what happened between Sophia and me that night was not something I had planned or engineered, or even fully processed until it was already happening. We didn't really talk until late in the evening, after dinner was served and the guests had moved into a more relaxed social mode. I had come out of the kitchen to oversee the dessert service, and she had wandered toward the kitchen hallway for some quiet, away from the louder conversations in the main room. She asked me if I was the chef. I said yes. She said the duck confit was the best thing she'd eaten in at least a year and asked me where I'd trained. We started talking. I mean really talking. The way you sometimes do with strangers when the night is late and the atmosphere is soft and neither of you has any agenda. She was warm and quick-minded and had this quality of genuine curiosity. She asked questions and then actually listened to the answers, which sounds like a low bar but is rarer than it should be. I told her about Emma, because I always tell people about Emma early, because Emma is the main fact of my life, and I have never wanted to hide that. She smiled in this way that was both tender and a little wistful, and she said, "That must be wonderful and terrifying." And I said, "Every day on both counts. What happened after that is between me and my own conscience and her, and I'll say only this: it was one night, it was entirely mutual and entirely adult, and when I drove home in the early hours of the morning I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a lightness, a warmth, something that whispered possibility. I had her number. She had mine. I told her I'd like to see her again. She said she'd like that too. I drove home feeling cautiously, quietly hopeful, in the way that a person allows themselves to feel hopeful when they've spent enough time being realistic about the world. She didn't call. I called once, left a voicemail that I'm sure was slightly too earnest, and then waited. Nothing. After 2 weeks I sent a text, something simple, something that left her room to respond however she wanted. Silence. After a month I accepted that whatever that night had been, it was complete in itself, and I let it go. I'm a practical person. I have a daughter to raise. I don't have the bandwidth to chase someone who isn't running toward me. So I folded it up neatly in my memory, labeled it as one genuinely beautiful evening that didn't become anything more, and I moved on. And then, 8 months later, those men in suits knocked on my door. I need you to understand the emotional geography of that moment. It was a Wednesday morning. Emma was at school. I had just gotten back from a grocery run and was still in my coat, bags on the counter, about to start prepping for a small luncheon job I had the next day. The knock was firm, official, not the knock of a neighbor or a delivery driver. I opened the door and there they were, 2 large men in tailored black suits, earpieces in faces like the side of a building. The one on the left handed me a card. It said, Hargrove Holdings, Executive Security, and below that a number. He said, "Mr. Calloway, my name is Lewis. I work for Mr. Edward Hargrove. He's requested a meeting with you at your earliest convenience. He's made his helicopter available if you're able to travel today, I said. I'm sorry, who? He said. Edward Hargrove, sir, of Hargrove Holdings, and that name, Hargrove, hit me like a cold wave, because I knew that name. Everyone in this part of the country knew that name. Edward Hargrove was, depending on who you asked, either a visionary industrialist or a ruthless corporate predator. He had built Hargrove Holdings from a regional timber and real estate company into a sprawling empire that touched logistics, technology infrastructure, agricultural land, and private equity. He was worth somewhere between $4 and $6 billion depending on market conditions. He was 63 years old. He was notoriously private, notoriously demanding, and notoriously uninterested in anyone who wasted his time. He had been married once, to a woman named Catherine Hargrove née Dunmore, who had passed away from cancer 11 years ago. They had one child, a daughter, named Sophia. I stood in my doorway for what felt like a very long time. Then I said, "Give me 2 hours," and I closed the door. I sat at my kitchen table and I tried to arrange the facts in front of me like pieces of a puzzle. Sophia Hargrove, Edward Hargrove's daughter, the woman I had met at a dinner party 8 months ago, the woman who had not called me back. Why would her father, one of the most powerful men in the Pacific Northwest, want to meet with me? I ran through possibilities. None of them felt comfortable. I called my friend Marcus. Not Emma's classmate, but my Marcus, my college friend who now worked as an attorney in Portland, and told him what was happening. He said, without hesitation, "Do not get on that helicopter without knowing why he wants to see you." I said, "I know." He said, "Do you want me to come with you?" I said I'd call him back. Then I sat there for another 20 minutes just breathing. Here's what I decided, and I want to be honest about my reasoning. I decided to go. Not because I wasn't scared. Not because I thought it couldn't go badly. I decided to go because the alternative, ignoring the summons of a billionaire who clearly already knew where I lived and had taken the time to find me, felt like a worse position to be in. Whatever Edward Hargrove wanted to say to me, I thought I was better off hearing it face to face, in a situation where I could look him in the eye, than wondering about it from the safety of my rental house, while he made whatever moves he was going to make anyway. I called Marcus back and told him where I was going and what I expected, and that if he didn't hear from me by 6 that evening he should start making calls. He was not happy about this. I told him I appreciated him. I arranged for my neighbor Janet, who was retired and had watched Emma for me before, to pick Emma up from school, and then I put on the best clothes I owned, a dark blazer, pressed trousers, clean shoes, and I went outside and got into the black car that was waiting for me. The Hargrove estate was not 40 minutes away by road. It was 40 minutes away by helicopter, which meant it was in a completely different category of remove from the world I inhabited. I had never been in a private helicopter before. I tried to treat the experience matter-of-factly, but I'll admit that the combination of the altitude, and the luxury, and the sheer scale of what I was flying toward, made it hard to pretend I wasn't rattled. The estate came into view below us as the helicopter descended, and I don't have another word for it except fortress. Not literally, but in every practical sense. Hundreds of acres of private land, a main house that was more like a compound, multiple outbuildings, manicured grounds that rolled toward the water's edge. It was the physical embodiment of a kind of power that most people only read about. A different man in a suit met me on the landing pad and walked me into the house without a word, through hallways lined with art that I suspected cost more than my annual income, into a study, the real kind, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a fireplace and leather furniture, where Edward Hargrove was already waiting. He was not what I expected. I think I expected someone who looked like money, polished, smooth-edged, the kind of man who had been pampered into sharpness. Instead, he was a big man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of weathered face that comes from decades of outdoor work before the wealth took over, white-haired, sharp-eyed, wearing a simple button-down shirt and dark trousers. He stood when I walked in, which surprised me. He extended his hand. I shook it. His grip was firm, deliberate, the handshake of a man who means every handshake. He gestured to the chair across from his and said simply, "Sit down, Mr. Calloway. Thank you for coming." His voice was even, not warm, not cold, controlled. I sat. He sat across from me. There was a long pause in which he looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. And then he said, "I'm going to speak plainly, because I find it's the only way to have a conversation that's worth having. My daughter Sophia is unwell. Has been for 7 months. I'm asking you here because there are things I need to know, and I suspect you're the only person who can answer some of them honestly." I said, "What's wrong with her?" He looked at me for a moment as if assessing whether the question was genuine. Then he said, "She's pregnant." I don't think I breathed for approximately 10 seconds. He said, "She is 7 months along. The child is yours. She has confirmed this. I'm not here to dispute it or to question it. I'm here because Sophia is struggling, both physically and emotionally, and because the situation my family is in requires that I understand the kind of man you are." I said, "Is she okay? Is she safe?" And something shifted in his expression. Just slightly, just for a moment when I said that. Like the question had surprised him, he said, "She is being cared for. She's had some complications with the pregnancy. She is stable." I said, "I didn't know. She didn't tell me. I called her, I texted her, and she didn't respond. I didn't know." He said, "I know. She told me." Another pause. "That doesn't entirely resolve my concerns about you, but it is a fact I have noted. I want to take a moment here and speak directly to you, because this is the point in the story where I was facing the most impossible emotional tangle I have ever faced in my life, and I want you to be right there with me in it." In the span of about 3 minutes, I had learned that a woman I had spent one significant, tender evening with was 7 months pregnant with my child, that she had been carrying this alone for most of her pregnancy, that she had not called me, and that her father, a man with more resources and influence than I could fully comprehend, was now sitting across from me evaluating me like I was applying for a job I hadn't known existed. And I had my daughter Emma at home, and I had my small, carefully built life, and every single thing felt like it was balancing on the head of a pin. So tell me, and I genuinely want to know, what would you have done in that chair? What would you have said next? Drop it in the comments right now, because what I did next is what determined everything. And before I tell you what happened next, I want you to really sit with that question, because the answer I gave Edward Hargrove in that room is the answer I would give again today, and I need you to understand why. I said, "Mr. Hargrove, I understand that you're trying to protect your daughter and that you have significant resources with which to do that, and I respect that instinct because I'm a father myself and I would do anything for my child. But I also need you to understand that if what you're telling me is true, then I am this child's father, and that means something to me that no amount of your concern or my current financial situation or the circumstances of how this child was conceived is going to change. I'm not here because your helicopter came for me. I'm here because if there's a child who is mine, I need to know about them and I need to be there for them. That's not negotiable for me. That's just who I am." I said this as calmly as I could, because I knew that projecting panic or aggression in that room was going to accomplish nothing. And when I finished, Edward Hargrove looked at me for a long, long moment. Then he said, "Sophia was afraid to tell you. I want to be accurate with you about that, because she told me herself. She was afraid that knowing would change the dynamic, that you would either run or that you would try to insert yourself in a way that felt like pressure. She made her own choices about how to handle this, and I have not always agreed with those choices, but she is my daughter, and I support her." He paused. "She's been asking about you for the last 3 weeks. She finally told me to find you." He paused again. "I wanted to meet you before I arranged anything. I needed to take your measure," I said. "And what's your measure?" He was quiet. Then he said, "You asked about her safety before you asked about your own position. That tells me something." He stood up, signaling that the first part of the conversation was over. "I'd like you to meet my daughter now, if you're willing." And that is how I found myself walking through the corridors of the Hargrove estate toward a suite of rooms in the East Wing, accompanied by one of the wealthiest and most intimidating men I had ever encountered. About to meet a woman I hadn't seen in 8 months who was carrying my child. Sophia was sitting in an armchair near a large window when we came in, and the first thing I noticed was how different and how exactly the same she looked. Her hair was longer. Her face had the particular fullness of late pregnancy. She was wearing comfortable clothes, a soft sweater, and she had a book open in her lap that she set down when she saw me. Her eyes found mine immediately, and she held my gaze with an expression that contained approximately 17 emotions simultaneously: relief, shame, hope, exhaustion, and something else that I think might have been a very careful, very guarded kind of longing. Her father said something quietly to her in what I think was Hindi. Her mother had been of South Asian descent. Sophia had inherited her mother's features and coloring, and I later learned she was fluent in 3 languages, and then he left the room. He actually left us alone. I sat down in the chair across from her, and for a moment neither of us said anything. Then I said, "Why didn't you call me?" "Not angry. Just asking." She said. "I was scared." I said, "Of me?" She shook her head slowly. "Of what this would become. Of what my father would do. Of the weight of it, of asking you to carry something that wasn't supposed to be part of your life." I said, You were supposed to let me decide that. She looked at her hands. I know, she said. I'm sorry, Daniel. I'm genuinely sorry, and I believed her. I believed her because I have a pretty functional ability to recognize real remorse, and what she was showing me was real. We talked for 3 hours that afternoon. She told me about the pregnancy, about the complications she'd had in the second trimester that had frightened her and led to more rest and monitoring. She told me about her life, the graphic design career she had, separate from her father's world and important to her as proof of her own capability, the complicated relationship she had always had with a father she loved, but who had spent most of her childhood prioritizing his empire over his family. She told me she had wanted to call me many times and had talked herself out of it each time. She told me she had always intended to tell me before the baby was born. I told her about Emma, and her face opened up in a way that was beautiful to see. She said, "She sounds incredible." I said, "She is the best person I know." She smiled at that, and it was the same smile I remembered from the dinner party. Real, unguarded, taking over her whole face. I told her what I needed to tell her, that I was going to be part of this child's life, that I understood the complications of the circumstances, and I wasn't interested in making her life harder, or in waging some kind of custody battle or in fighting her father. But that I had done this once before, with Emma, and I knew what it meant to be a parent who showed up, and I was not going to be the parent who didn't show up for this child. She listened to all of this without interrupting me, and when I was done she nodded slowly and said, "I don't want you to not be there. I think I was always afraid of what it would look like if you were, but I don't actually want that," I said. "Okay, then let's figure it out, together." She looked at me for a moment like she was waiting for a catch, like she'd been trained to expect the catch. When it didn't come, something in her posture changed. She softened, just slightly, but visibly. Edward Hargrove came back to the room about an hour before I was due to leave, and the second conversation I had with him was very different from the first. He was still controlled, still deliberate, but the quality of his attention had changed. He sat down and he said, "Sophia has told me that she'd like to explore a co-parenting arrangement with you. I want to understand what that looks like practically, given your circumstances." Now there was a slight edge to that last phrase, your circumstances, and I addressed it directly. I said, "You mean the fact that I'm not wealthy?" He met my eyes without flinching. He said, "I mean the fact that you are a single father with a limited income and an inconsistent work schedule, and that my daughter's child is going to require significant resources and stability." I said, "My daughter Emma has had everything she needs her entire life. She has never been hungry, she has never been unsafe, she has never been unloved for a single hour. I am not wealthy, but I am a good father. Those are not the same variable." He looked at me for a moment and then something unexpected happened. He smiled. Not warmly, not easily, but genuinely. He said, "No, they are not the same variable." He paused. "I owe you a degree of respect, Mr. Calloway. You are not what I anticipated." I said, "What did you anticipate?" He said, "Someone who would see this situation as leverage." He looked at me squarely. "Many people have, over the years. People who saw my daughter as a means to access something else." He said it without self-pity, just as a fact, with the quiet exhaustion of a man who had spent decades watching his family be treated as a resource. And I understood something in that moment about Edward Hargrove that I hadn't understood before. That underneath the power and the control and the intimidating efficiency, there was a father who had lost his wife and raised his daughter largely alone, in the middle of an empire that attracted predators, and who had been afraid for years of the wrong person getting close to someone he loved. He wasn't so different from me. He was just operating on a vastly different scale. I said, "I'm not here for your money or your company or your connections. I'm here for my child, and if it's possible, I'd like to be here for Sophia too, as a co-parent, as a support system, as whatever she needs. I'm not asking for anything else." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "My attorney will be in touch about a formal co-parenting agreement. I'd like the terms to be fair to both parties. If you have an attorney, please have them available." I said I did. He stood, extended his hand again. This time the handshake was different. Still firm, still deliberate, but warmer. Just slightly, just enough. My son was born 6 weeks later. We named him Samuel. Samuel James Calloway Hargrove, which was Sophia's idea and which she proposed with a quiet dignity that made me understand that she was, in her own way, trying to honor something, trying to say with his name that he belonged to both worlds without being owned by either. He was born at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday, in a private hospital outside Portland, and I was in the room. Sophia had called me when her labor started, a 3 a.m. call that I answered on the second ring, already half awake, because I had been keeping my phone close for weeks. I got in my car and I drove through the dark, and I was there when Samuel came into the world, and when the nurse put him in my arms for the first time I stood there completely undone. 7 pounds 4 ounces, dark hair. A face that was immediately and undeniably his own, though I could see Sophia in him and I could see something around the eyes that I recognized from my own face in photographs from when I was young. Emma met her brother 3 days after he was born. I had told her, in age-appropriate stages over the preceding weeks, that there was a baby coming. A baby who was her brother, who had a different mother than she did, who was going to be part of our family in a new way. She had processed this with the particular intensity that she processed everything, asking questions that were sometimes very simple and sometimes startlingly deep. The morning we went to meet him at the hospital, she held my hand in the elevator and said, very seriously, "Daddy, what if he doesn't like me?" And I told her that he was going to love her, because how could he not? And that her job right now was just to say hello. She walked into that room, saw her baby brother in the clear hospital bassinet, and looked at him for a very long time without saying anything. Then she turned to Sophia, who she was meeting for the first time, and said, with tremendous seriousness, "I'm Emma. I will protect him." Sophia's eyes filled with tears. Mine did too, and I'm not ashamed of that. The weeks that followed were genuinely complex in ways that I won't minimize. Sophia and I were not a couple. And navigating the emotional terrain of sharing a child with someone, while also developing a relationship of trust and cooperation, from a standing start requires a degree of intentional communication that doesn't come naturally to anyone. There were difficult conversations. There were moments of misunderstanding. There were times when the shadow of Edward Hargrove's resources fell across our dynamic, and I had to be honest and direct about feeling sidelined. And there were times when Sophia had to be honest about her own fear of dependency and her need to make decisions for herself and her child. But we did the work. We both did the work, consistently and with good faith, and I think we were both surprised by how much we respected each other for it. Edward Hargrove, for his part, did something that I did not expect. About 2 months after Samuel was born, he called me directly, not through his attorney, not through a representative, but on my personal phone, which he had from the card exchange at the estate. He asked me if he could take me to lunch. I said yes, because by then I was curious enough and felt secure enough to say yes. We sat across from each other in a restaurant in Portland. He had chosen somewhere understated, which I thought was deliberate, and he talked to me differently than he had at the estate. He talked to me like a person, like a peer, in a way that told me he had been thinking about things. He said, "I've been watching how you handle yourself these past 2 months. I've been watching you with Samuel and with my daughter and with Emma." He looked at his coffee cup. "I spent 30 years building something because I thought that was the best way to protect the people I loved. But I think I got it confused somewhere along the way. I think I started protecting the structure instead of protecting the people." He paused. "Your daughter said she would protect her brother. She's 5 years old." He shook his head slightly. "That is not something Monty teaches a child." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "You did the best you knew how to do. That's what all of us are doing." He looked at me. He said, "You're more generous than I deserve." I said, "You're more self-aware than people probably give you credit for." He gave a short, dry laugh, the first real laugh I'd heard from him. And something between us that had been careful and formal and slightly adversarial became in that moment something else. Not friendship, not exactly, but the beginning of a mutual regard, an understanding between two people who both loved the same child and who had decided, against the odds of the circumstances that had brought them together, to act like adults about it. Sophia and I want to be careful with this part because it is personal and ongoing and not entirely mine to tell. We became closer over those months in a way that neither of us had planned and both of us had, I think, privately hoped for. We were honest with each other about what we felt and what we were afraid of and what we needed. We didn't rush anything. I was clear with her that my first priority was Samuel and Emma, and that I wasn't going to let romantic feeling complicate the co-parenting dynamic unless we were both absolutely certain we were approaching it with clear eyes. She was clear with me that she was not going to repeat the pattern of withdrawing when things felt complicated, that she had learned from what she'd put both of us through, and that she was committed to a different way of being. We are, as I record this story, taking things slowly. We are honest with each other. We laugh a lot when we are together, which I think is one of the best signs there is. I won't tell you where this is going because I genuinely don't know, and I think that's okay. Some things deserve to be lived rather than predicted. But here is what I want to tell you about Edward Hargrove, because I think this is the part of the story that surprised me most of all. And the part that still gets me right in the middle of the chest when I think about it. 4 months after Samuel was born, I arrived at the Hargrove estate for what had become a fairly regular occurrence, a Sunday afternoon visit where both Samuel and Emma came to spend time with Sophia, and increasingly, with Edward, who had turned out to have a quiet and enormous love for his grandchildren that he had absolutely no idea how to express and was trying, visibly and earnestly, to learn. Emma had decided that she liked him, which, in Emma's world, meant she was willing to hold his hand during walks around the property, and had once shown him how to draw a horse from memory, which he had tolerated with a patience that told me more about him than any business profile ever could. On this particular Sunday I arrived a little early and was shown to the main sitting room where I found Edward alone, sitting at a desk writing something by hand. He looked up when I came in and set down his pen, and he said, "Sit down, Daniel." "Not Mr. Calloway, Daniel." I sat down. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "I want to apologize to you." I said, "For what?" He said, "For the way I brought you here in the beginning, for sending men to your door like you were a problem to be managed, for treating your life as a variable in an equation instead of," he paused, "instead of what it actually is, a life, a good one." I waited, he said. "You have built something real with very little. You are raising 2 children with a grace and a groundedness that I spent 30 years having every resource in the world and still could not manage to find in myself." His jaw was tight, the way it gets when he is fighting through something. "My daughter is better for knowing you. My grandson is lucky to have you as his father, and I was not kind to you in the beginning, and you did not deserve that, and I am sorry." I sat with that for a long moment. And then I said, "You were protecting your daughter. I would have done the same thing. I have done the same thing, on a much smaller scale. I don't hold it against you." He looked at me, he said, "You're a better man than I've been." I said, "I've had less at stake. It's easier to be generous when you're not carrying the weight of all that." He shook his head. He said, "I don't believe that. I think character is character at any scale." We sat together in a comfortable silence for a while, the way men sometimes do when the important thing has been said, and neither of them needs to fill the air with anything additional. Then Emma came running in, slightly out of breath, announcing that the horses were outside, and she wanted to go see them. And Edward Hargrove, billionaire, patriarch, man who had once sent 2 suits to my front door to summon me like a problem, stood up, straightened his shirt, took my daughter's hand and said, "Well then, let's go see them." I stood in the doorway and watched them walk toward the window, together, my 5-year-old daughter chattering at full speed about which horse she thought looked friendliest, and this 63-year-old man listening to every word like it was the most important briefing he'd received all year. And something in that image, the smallness and the hugeness of it, the impossibility of the road that had led to this exact moment, hit me in a way I still feel when I think about it. Life is strange. Life is genuinely strange. It will put you on a helicopter you never asked for, and land you in a room with someone who seems to be everything you're not, and it will slowly, over months of hard and honest work, reveal that underneath the difference in resources and circumstance and power, there are just people trying to love their children well enough. Samuel is now 3 months old. He sleeps through most of the night, which Emma tells me is because she sings to him, which may or may not be true, but which I am absolutely not going to dispute. Emma is thriving in kindergarten and has recently informed me that she wants to be a horse veterinarian who also runs a bakery, and I have told her that as a completely achievable combination of careers. My catering business is growing, partly, I'll be honest, because Sophia mentioned me to some of her friends in Portland, who host exactly the kind of private events I do well, which she did without my knowledge, and presented as a fait accompli, and which I was initially conflicted about and subsequently grateful for. Edward and I have lunch about once a month. We talk about things that matter. He has told me in his quiet, deliberate way that he thinks Samuel is the best thing that has happened to his family in years. He said it without sentimentality, just as a fact, which is the most Edward Hargrove way of saying something tender that I can imagine. I did not expect any of this. I did not expect that one evening at a hillside estate would lead to the expansion of my family in this particular direction, or that I would find myself sitting across from a man who controls the fates of thousands of employees and treating him, in the end, as something like a friend. I did not expect that the most terrifying morning of my life, opening my door to those black-suited men, my daughter's hand on the back of my shirt, would lead to something I can only describe as a kind of grace. Not without difficulty, not without fear, not without moments where I genuinely didn't know if I was going to land on my feet. But grace nonetheless, what I know. Having lived through this and come out the other side still standing, still here, still myself is this. You cannot protect your life from the unexpected. You can only decide what kind of person you're going to be when the unexpected arrives. Are you going to let fear make the decision? Or are you going to take a breath, put on your best blazer, and get on the helicopter? I got on the helicopter, and I would do it again 1,000 times. If this story meant something to you, if you found yourself on my side through any part of it, please hit that like button, because it genuinely helps more people find their way to this channel and to the stories we tell here. And subscribe, if you haven't already, because we are nowhere close to done with stories like this one. Stories about ordinary people in extraordinary situations, about the unexpected places that love and family and courage can come from. Leave me your thoughts in the comments section. Tell me what you would have done at any point in this story. Tell me when you were surprised, when you were frustrated, when something hit you right in the heart. I read every single comment and I want to hear from you. This community means everything to me and to this channel, and every story I tell, I'm telling with you in mind. Take care of yourselves, take care of the people you love, and I will see you all in the next story.